This is System Crash, a weekly tech news show willing to tell the hard truths about how tech and the titans who own and operate it is really transforming the world. I'm Paris Marks.
And I'm Brian Merchant.
This system has just begun to crash, so support the show by heading over to patreon.com/systemcrashpod, where you can sign up to get monthly bonus episodes. Also, rate the show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. This week, we are back to the news. And of course, Elon Musk is making more news, as he always tends to do. We had this big Tesla earnings call, but also news about his future with Doge, what it might be. And so we figured we need to dig into that. And then later in the episode, we'll have an interview relating to some more international questions, particularly around Canada and the Canadian election that is about to happen next week on Monday, actually. So quite soon. But Brian, what did you make of this Elon Musk news, this earnings call, his future at Doge? What is happening there?
Yeah, seems like at this point it's only been 2 months, really, of the Trump administration and Elon.
Dude, it feels like 2 years.
It feels like so long, which, as everybody will say, is by design. They're flooding the zone and trying to do what they can with the social and political capital that they have. It makes it hard to resist or yell about any piece of it if it's all happening at once. Basically, we saw signs that the facade was cracking in the Elon sort of power base, I guess, in the Trump White House, going back to when he failed to move the needle on the Wisconsin Supreme Court election, and even maybe was a liability in the end, despite spending millions of dollars, wearing his cheese hat and looking a little bit like a dummy.
I don't know how the voters of Wisconsin didn't go for that.
Elon Musk in a cheese hat promising to fire you. Yeah, what? It's so appealing. I can't.
But he's also handing out checks to connected people who the party wants to make sure is in the circle,
Right. Like literally trying to buy it. If all that shit works and you win the election, then you can stay in the good graces. But one thing we know about Trump is that he doesn't like losers. He doesn't like people who lose. He doesn't like weakness. And, as long as Musk is the richest man in the world, he's going to get a special aura, I think, of invincibility as far as Trump's concerned. But I do feel like it complicated things.
This is the moment when I wish I could do a Trump impression, but I really can't. So.
I know every time I think about doing one, I'm just like, let's leave that on the table.
As we know, I can't do a Brian Merchant impression. I also can't do a Trump impression.
Unless you're doing one right now. Unless this is just you. I just need to do more crosstalk to prove to all the haters out there who think I'm a figment of Paris's imagination. It is interesting to me, it did ultimately come down to the stock price and the performance of Tesla and the fact that it has been materially affected by backlash against his operations with Doge, with the organized protests, which have really gotten under his skin. So, a round of applause to all the takedown protesters who've been showing up at dealerships and at protests around the world, because you have deeply affected the outcome of this of Musk's involvement in politics,
and almost got him crying on national television. It's beautiful.
I listened to some of the earnings call, so I get to state what that is. So on the earnings call, he announced a couple of things. Tesla announced, number one, that profits are down 71%, which is
incredible.
Crazy. Yeah, it's really crazy, and it shows just how much consumer sentiment has started. I mean, there's a number of factors in there, right? They were actually, the company was failing to sort of facilitate deliveries at the same pace. There's some fatigue with the brand models that they have, and Cybertrucks have been a failure by and large.
I'm shocked. I can't believe it. I can't believe people aren't going for it. Yeah,
I know. I mean, you drive yours all the time.
Yeah, I know.
You're recording this podcast from the bed of a Cybertruck.
Isn't that where you record from as well?
All the time, roving around LA.
It's in self-driving mode and you're just in the back recording a podcast.
Didn't you two catch some flack for doing a video where they were in the bed of a truck that drove around New York, and they were supposed to be cheering people up as they performed? That's the opposite of that, is recording a tech critical podcast in the back of a of a Cybertruck that bums everyone out. Anyways, so there's a lot of things that contributed, but clearly, and we'll play a little clip of the earnings call right here so you can hear it.
Now, the protests that you'll see out there, they're very organized. They're paid for. They're obviously not going to admit that the reason that they're protesting is because they're receiving fraudulent money, or that recipients of wasteful largesse, but they're going to come up with some other reason. But that is the real reason for the protests. The actual reason is that those receiving the waste and fraud wish to continue receiving it. That is the real thing that's going on here, obviously.
He's really angry and almost seething in his way about what's happened to Tesla. And he's fabricated this really dumb narrative in his own mind that the people showing up to the Tesla takedown protests are the people who have been robbed of their fraud and waste that Doge has taken away. So in his mind, it's just like all people from US Aid who are coming out to yell at Tesla, and not just people who are furious about what's happening to the state of American democracy and how this unelected oligarch is wielding power.
It's either that or they're paid protesters by like George Soros or something. Right?
Exactly. So they're paid and they're organized, as you can hear in this clip. I was thinking it's just like, it's very sort of one-dimensional. It's so simplistic. It's almost childish.
Elon Musk, childish? What are you talking about?
I cannot. It comports so much with his like this video game mindset where you do one thing and then like the bad guys do something else, and their motivations are just one-to-one, and he just can't. There's politicians who will spin things and reach for the most sort of salient message that's going to be most popular or sort of play the best. Elon Musk doesn't. I think he really believes this. I think he really is this dumb on a social level. Not only does he think that he actually maybe is rooting out fraud and abuse because he looked at a spreadsheet and misread it, and that was all the evidence that he needed. He is very sort of dull-brained in this way. I do think he's sitting there on this earnings call telling people, oh well, we're just succeeding so much that I think that if we don't carry out Doge, then it's gonna lead to the destruction of America, and then there'll be no Tesla. So we have to keep doing this. And but the big news is that Tesla's down 71%, profits are down.
And automotive revenue is down 20% on top of that as well, right?
Yeah. So Tesla said it earned $409 million, down from $1.4 billion in the first quarter of last year of 2024. It's a huge, stark decline. Investors, before this have been sort of goading him to sort of give up the Doge stuff, both because they know it's bad for the brand and because they know that him returning will be this symbolic gesture and the stock market will celebrate, which is pretty much exactly what happened, because Musk says that he's going, after the end of the month in May, he's going to be allocating more of his time away from Doge, and he's not leaving. He's still going to be doing a day a week or something, he says. A day a week instead of just kind of like camping out in the White House and being the first buddy. It was enough to say, yay, Elon's going back to Tesla to save the day. And so the market was back up at time of recording today.
Yeah, which is Wednesday, we should say, because who knows, by end of the week, it'll be crashed back down again.
Might be new tariffs or whatever. And yeah.
Well, I feel like that also played into the story as well, right? Not to completely get off of Tesla and Doge, like we can come back to it in a second, but there are increasing stories now about, basically the Trump administration is going to be close to making a deal with China. And the suggestions I've seen are that China's not actually offering very much. It's just like they realize the impact of these tariffs is very negative for the United States, and so they're going to be rolling them back. And there's also discussions of other potential like tariff rollbacks and changes in the types of approach there that could be beneficial to Tesla, but is not driven just solely by Tesla, but by the broader impacts of Trump's global trade war and what that is meaning for different places. And I believe on the call, Elon Musk not just called out the impact of tariffs specifically, but how Tesla saw diversification into Canada and Mexico as a key part of kind of like future growth, and that this trade war really gets in the way of that.
And that is like the one thing that Musk says, that he's like, I'm going to keep trying to sort of advocate for lower tariffs to the Trump administration, because that it's one of the clear points of contention between the two camps. But so far Trump hasn't really listened all that much. I don't, it's hard to say what is even going on. He's cutting deals, and it's now turned into a patchwork, and who knows what's going to go back into effect at the end of the month. Clearly all the hardcore capitalists and the tech guys, they don't like the tariffs, but the tariffs have, as we've seen, have been one of the hardest to dislodge ideas from Trump's addled brain, because he just has such an affinity for for them. Clearly, it's just something.
It's a beautiful word. It's a beautiful word.
It's a beautiful word, like groceries.
Yeah.
So while I do think the Tesla takedown folks should take a victory lap, and I do think that this is sort of a victory, and that like it does show the power of organized protest and smart protest and that kind of resistance, it does worry me a little bit that if Musk is less involved in Doge and he's not wandering around the Capitol and he's not sort of participating directly, that some of the media spotlight will kind of fall away from the Doge program in general. He has done, I'd say, most of the work, right? Like he has organized the program, he's staffed it up with his lackeys, and he's sort of associated himself with it. He's become the avatar of Doge instead of someone from the Trump administration that everybody can just sort of get mad at and write off and then get fired or whatever. He's become like kind of a human blame shield from Trump for doing these firings and doing these layoffs. There's been some reporting that Russ Vought, who had architected a lot of the other sort of transformations in government, was initially seen as a rival to Musk, but now they've, sort of linked up. And now he's kind of getting to wield influence with the benefit of Musk's, or initially with the benefit of Musk's sort of celebrity. Now it's arguable whether it's become sort of more of a liability or not. Certainly he's riled up the conservative wing of the party, and they've been cheering Musk. And so it does become this, I think, this sort of complicated moment, because Doge is still going to continue gutting the government as much as it can, because that has been an objective of Trump's program, or those more activated folks within it. So I do wonder what happens to those narratives if Musk does like go back to Tesla. I just worry because the media loves a narrative.
But that's where I think I disagree with you a bit, right?
Yeah.
Is that yes, they love a narrative, but I feel like because Elon Musk has been so central to this, so much of the focus has been able to be like, this is what Elon Musk is doing. This is what Elon Musk's bros are doing. Elon, Doge is Elon.
Yeah.
And I feel like if he is more separated from it, and again, he still says he's going to be doing like weekly work on this project, so he's not fully going away, but maybe in him taking a bit more of a step back, not being as much of a visible figurehead, and we'll see if he actually does that in practice. Maybe he'll find that more difficult to do than he seems to think, or maybe that's just something he's telling investors because he knows that Tesla is in trouble right now and he needs to try to save some parts of the business because it has been declining and doing so badly, and saying he's going to take a step back from Doge is very helpful for the share price and investor confidence and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I think if he realistically does step away a bit, it also makes it easier to be like, oh, here is what is actually going on in Doge. Here are the people who are actually like wielding the levers of power and moving things forward, because I don't think that Elon Musk is the real mastermind behind Doge. He's certainly the figurehead. He's the public face of it. He is making tweets that are shaping some of what it's doing. But there are people who, like we've talked about Project 2025, there are people in kind of this right-wing project who have been designing this whole campaign for years. And I'm sure are engaged in seeing it through, making sure it takes effect. And I feel like those people are not receiving the kind of scrutiny that they maybe deserve, because it's easier to be like, look, it's Elon and it's Elon's boys and all this kind of stuff, right?
No, I totally agree. In fact, I think it really depends on how effectively folks can keep the pressure on. And some of that onus is going to fall to workers. And in fact, this weekend, I wrote a piece about what federal workers can do now at this like sort of this point of potential vulnerability. Like a lot of these big reductions in forces that have been ordered by Doge and by the Trump administration are not necessarily legal, and are they kind of depend on department heads signing off on them and going along with them or not resisting them, and so it really does remain to be seen how various parties sort of respond to this vacuum, because I could see it going either way. And I do think it's a tremendous opportunity for federal workers, for activists, for pro-democracy activists to get in there and to sort of take advantage of the fact that Elon has fallen away and these guys who are much less popular, much more polarizing. The story is all about big balls and not about Elon. Then I feel like you're right. It becomes much less sympathetic.
But I also think it's helpful to frame Doge as like this tech invasion of government, that is trying to do efficiency through tech and bringing the tech model to the federal workforce than being like, oh, look, there's all these right-wing ghouls who are undertaking this campaign and using this like tech narrative, tech framing to get a degree of legitimacy that would never be there if they didn't have Elon Musk and the Doge boys and stuff taking the flag.
100%. That's what it is. It is like the veneer. That's what the AI first strategy is all about. But, I feel like on a campaign level, that is completely true. And you can say that, all they've done is add a veneer of sort of like Silicon Valley trappings and sort of mindset to it, because what they're actually doing nuts and bolts, besides saying they want to replace people with AI, are really just sort of, mass layoffs and, sticking a little widget in instead here and there. We know there's a few chatbots and things around, but I think that's why these two movements, the Project 2025 movement and like the Silicon Valley right, has wound up being so aligned, because they're basically after very similar things with certain points of contention for sure, but it really does come down to the details. Like Musk's and the Silicon Valley crew really, want to keep some level of immigration only because they're used to exploiting those workers at their tech companies, whereas the 2025 cohort doesn't want to have any black or brown people coming into the country at all, really. I do think it's going to be a really interesting moment, and I do think it is a sign of the project's flagging power. Don't get me wrong, it's still quite estimable. It's still quite potent and has the authority of the state and has immense power behind it. But there are vulnerabilities here now that are beginning to show, which again, as we talked about up top, like this is what, they're afraid of and why they rushed into so many of these things.
Well, I would say we could also see it as like the fragilities or whatnot, but we could also see it as kind of like moving from stage 1 to stage 2, right? To a stage of destroying things, to like entrenchment of this new model of running government, right? Like, I think there's still very clear risks there.
It still really remains to be seen whether they can do that at all or whether they have a plan for it at all. I think as much as this has been a little bit better organized than Trump 1.0, it's still unclear what does happen after you swing the wrecking ball, and whether or not they actually think the AI chatbots are actually going to do government, or whether they care, or whether they've thought about what actually happens when people do care that government doesn't work, or that there's tens of thousands of more people out of work and unemployed and screaming at Republicans in town halls. It is another moment with a lot of question marks.
That's when you beef up the police budget and the military budget, I guess.
And then, you have a guy who's in charge of the military who's just like chatting about bombing Yemen on family group texts. So it's like, is the military, again, I do feel like it's...
And going on like seemingly drunken rants when he's called out about it.
Yeah, exactly. Who is a known drunk and just a horrible person. And then,
Dude literally has like Nazi tattoos. Like,
literally does. And they're circling the wagons around him again and again. The party is. But one thing that, I wonder about, and I would love to see more reporting on, is like how, like, what does like rank and file military and soldiers and people, what do they think of this buffoon? This guy's a clown. Clearly there are departments and plenty of people who are quite allied with Trump, and certainly ICE, and there are all these ghouls who are completely willing to put on a face mask and apprehend a college student who wrote an op-ed and throw her into an unmarked van. What is the breadth of that support? Like, I guess maybe call me an optimist, but I don't know, how widespread it is. We did see Trump taking more effort to clear ranks of non-loyal, quote, DOD officials and whatnot. But
I feel like my vibe is that the police and like CBP, the border services and stuff, tend to be much more kind of like fascist, right-wing.
More ideological, yeah,
than like the military, which is not to say that the military is like a hotbed of liberal support or anything, but I feel like it's distinct from what you see in those other kind of groups, right?
I guess I'm just trying to say that like there are fissures in unexpected places, as monstrous as everything that's happening right now, as horrible as it is, as certain as Elon Musk is to continue wielding power in many ways. I do think that these vulnerabilities that are being exposed on different fronts are real and are there and can be exploited, and people need to keep standing up, keep showing up, up, keep organizing, keep protesting. The piece I wrote today was an interview with the labor studies professor at Rutgers, Eric Blanc, and he's been following the federal workers' jobs crisis and its confrontations with Doge and drawing lessons from the recent spate of organizing over the last few years and seeing what's worked. And he has made a lot of good arguments that, like, now is the time for federal workers to really push back, make noise, do things that might go viral, get more attention, really sort of crystallize the opposition. It's hard to do, it's risky, but at this point, the trend lines are all towards sort of the risk is you might just fall victim to a big Doge cut anyways. I thought that there was a lot of wisdom in that, and it's hard. And I've already had people after I published this reaching out to me saying, I've signed up to get involved. I'm ready to stand up and to think about ways to resist more. And I do think that's an encouraging sign for sure.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I would say, just to go back to the Tesla call really briefly, the earnings call and stuff, one of the things that stood out from that too, that I saw Ed Niedermeyer tweeting about, or blue skying about, or whatever we're calling it now, was basically that one of the areas Tesla identified as a growing part of its business that's still doing well as the automotive part is struggling is the battery business, selling batteries to utilities. And he just kind of flagged that, like, hey, this might be another place for Tesla takedown organizers to focus on in the near future if we're looking to continue damaging this company, right? Because yeah, the auto business is one piece of it, but Tesla is involved in other things as well. And I think it stood out to me that on that earnings call again, Elon Musk was calling out the robots as this kind of major future growth play, which many people really don't believe is going anywhere. And he was again promising that self-driving is going to be here next year, going to be making all this money, blah, 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 which like no one really buys, right? Except maybe some really diehard core Tesla people. And I do wonder that, like, okay, if Elon Musk really says he's not spending as much time at Doge and spending more time at Tesla, you have to wonder if that's actually a good thing, right? Like, this is the guy who pushed the Cybertruck onto the company, who wanted it to look a particular way and be a particular way, and kind of forced the company's designers to make what he wanted. And it's been a total flop. He's the guy who went in and said, we don't want a cheaper car, we want a robo-taxi. And now we see them getting like creamed by these Chinese EV makers in the rest of the world. And of course, also struggling in North America as well for distinct reasons. So like, is the idea that Elon Musk returning to Tesla, I don't know, like obviously the investors of Tesla are people who tend to believe, I would say, that Elon Musk is some great man or whatnot, but in reality, he makes terrible decisions for this company.
but it's almost immaterial. And I would like, for everybody who already listened to our Elon and Power episode with Ed, they know. But if you haven't, I go listen to that episode, because it really sort of articulates what's going on there and why, despite everything that you just said being true, Elon returning is still enough to rally the stock market. Like, he hasn't made like a good, sound financial decision in a long time, and all of the promises of late, even excluding all the Doge stuff, just in the context of Tesla, like the robot butlers and cyber. Yeah, and the big thing that came out of this was he went cybercab. It was all like, he's like, oh, and he's imagining it this time next year again, as you said. Like, it is all very fantastical, but the market has just kind of agreed that Elon is the Superman. The actual revenues coming out of the company are secondary to this belief that the Elon can sort of will more profits, will more expansion, will more product lines and companies into existence, whether or not they like work or are profitable or anything. I mean, that's been the story of Tesla over the last 10 years, as Ed Niedermeyer pointed out to us, starting with the full self-driving, which has still yet to actually materialize. The promise, it's all, a fantasy. And Wall Street was just so happy to go back. It's because like Doge, if anything, draws everyone out of that fantasy and into real people dealing with his decisions and dealing with his politics, and real people getting fired, real people getting angry. And it complicates the picture in a way that nobody who is invested in Tesla wanted to see. And so it remains to be seen whether it will go back up to the height before the whole Doge incursion. But there are clearly a lot of people who are still willing to just sort of be happy with this deeply stupid sort of conception of of Musk as the entrepreneurial Iron Man that, he's worked so hard to cultivate over the last 20 years.
Yeah, that's why I don't believe that like the Wednesday stock bump actually lasts. Like, reality has to set in.
Yeah.
Based on what you were saying about the self-driving and stuff, there was this funny part in the earnings call when it got to like the questions aspect of it, where an analyst from Wells Fargo basically asked Musk about like dust and fog and glare issues with the cameras when you're thinking about driving automation, because Musk's big thing was like, you don't need this LiDAR sensor. You can just rely on cameras and that will be perfectly fine. And he was like, isn't this going to cause a problem like when the cameras are obscured by different weather things or the sun or whatever? And on the call, Musk claimed that Tesla uniquely, quote, bypasses the digital signal processor and does, quote, direct photon counting. And so the guy followed up and he was like, so the camera still works when there's direct glare on the camera that like obscures thing? And Musk was like, yeah, of course. Like, and it was like, dude, this is such a bullshit lie. Like, what are you talking about?
He's just so adept at that level of bullshit. It just spews out of him naturally. Like he does,
Yeah.
On some level he believes that probably. He just, because he's willed himself to believe it. He just,
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I have no doubt. But it's like, this is a fraudster. Like, why is he not?
Lives in a
why
video
is he
game
still
world.
able to get away with this?
Yeah, exactly. He lives in a video game world. This guy is an NPC to him, and this is just like something that he could select from the drop-down menu to say to override it. What does not matter if it's true or not. One of those situations where you're like, I'm not surprised that the market is rallying around this, but like also like the world is so stupid. Like it's because
Totally.
Yo, Musk is back. Yeah. What is he gonna do? Everybody's, and I think you're right that it's just gonna set in again. Just like, oh right, like no one's gonna forget that he's a huge asshole. He's still on Twitter. He's still gonna be showing up in photo ops with the president, and it's still like
The Tesla boycotts are not ending just because he's spending a few fewer days at Doge.
And even one of the investors, I think one of the lead investors was in one of their published briefings or whatever, was like, he's done irreparable damage at this point. Like it's done.
And there was a report in Reuters the other day that even their attempts to like do a cheaper car kind of thing continue to get delayed. Like, I don't know, this whole company is a shambles. They just had the complete recall of all the Cybertrucks a few weeks ago, which I believe we discussed. Like, this company is a mess and it has fewer prospects. It was like the dominant company in the EV sector, and it is clearly like having its ass handed to it by Chinese competitors at this point. And we have a story in the kind of wrap up at the end that deals with that, so we can leave it until then. But like, no one in their right mind really believes that Tesla is going to be like a dominant EV company in the future or anything at this point. Like, or if they do, they're like delusional in my view.
Yeah, I think it's just resting back on sort of like the momentum and the inertia from the last 10 years and just like praying to the gods of the marketplace that bygones can be bygones and that like this fantasy can continue to be propelled forward. Because yeah, certainly based on any of the numbers coming out of the company, any of its actual prospects, I wonder, what it would take to wake people, a recession. Pretty remarkable that we're back here. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Yeah.
But like, as we've been talking about, obviously people understand what Doge is at this point, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's very clear what this organization has done, what this ideology is doing, but we still see internationally these efforts by right-wing parties to say that they are going to pursue Doge-like programs, right? Which is kind of wild to see, especially like as the reality of what this project is becomes clearer and clearer, but to still see them talking about it is kind of wild. I've written in the past about how tech folks in Canada have been embracing right-wing ideologies like what we're seeing in the United States, and many of them in Canada, but other places as well, calling for their own versions of Doge to kind of dismantle the government in their own countries. And so, as listeners will likely know, Canada is in an election at the moment. We go to the polls on Monday, April 28th, where it's looking like we're going to elect a liberal government, not a conservative government. So maybe discussions of Doge are not as key right now, though I'm going to write a piece, hopefully before the election, on how the Liberal Party isn't a great savior from these tech ideologies either. And leader Mark Carney, because of his longstanding relationships to the tech industry, the Liberals released their platform just the other day, and there's a whole section in there about embracing AI, building AI data centers, implementing it in the public service. And it's like
classic stuff.
shitheads are gonna be doing a lot of terrible stuff we still have to be on guard for. But there was an article published in DSmog in cooperation with The Lever, and it's basically explaining how the right in Canada is kind of organizing and discussing how it would look to do something similar in the Canadian context. So the author, Jeff Dembicki, the global managing editor of DSmog and the author of the Petroleum Papers, basically wrote this article because there was this recent kind of gathering of conservative voices, and you had fossil fuel executives, you had an Amazon Web Services senior public policy person, and you had people from like libertarian think tanks on stage together discussing what it would look like to implement a Doge in Canada and why it would be good for their various different interests. And so when I saw this, given all that we discussed on the show, given that the Canadian election is so close, I was like, I think we should have Geoff on for a quick chat to understand what is happening here, because this is important for Canada, but I also think it's important for the broader conversation about what the right globally is doing and how they're trying to approach this stuff.
I think it's really important. I do think it's another open question why this juncture again is so important with like how we respond to like Musk's quote stepping away from Doge and like viewing Doge as its own independent entity with its own independent logics and how related they are to that Silicon Valley mindset and the AI mindset. It's an opportunity to think about how conservative movements can export those ideologies for their own benefit, whether or not they'll be successful without a charismatic or at least notorious figurehead like Musk. I think we should be interrogating AI in general and like what, as, people sort of like, well, it's AI is a tool or it's an exciting thing in this case, but we don't like how it's being used over here. But we have to consider sort of the general suite of ideologies and programs that it enables, like this one, right? Like with everybody harping on about AI and how it's going to transform the world and how it's going to disrupt whole economies and all these, it opens up spaces for Doges and maybe what's going to happen in Canada and other parties. So I think it is really an interesting and important time to look at the ways that they are trying to export these properties elsewhere.
I completely agree. And so here's our interview with Jeff Dembicki. I was really happy he could chat with me to dig into all this, and we'll be back on the other side with some final stories to wrap up this week's episode. Jeff, thanks for coming on System Crash.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. You have this fantastic story, and I just wanted to dig into it even more, right? To learn more about it, because I think for our audience, it's going to be really important to understand how these things are working, not just in the United States, but other parts of the world. And so I wanted to start before we dig into kind of the meat of the story. We have an election right now in Canada. Pierre Poilievre is the leader of the Conservative Party, and up until recently was running high in the polls. Has Pierre Poilievre said anything about Doge or about a similar kind of plan? Or is there anything in the Conservative Party policy platform that suggests that they want to pursue some kind of program like that?
Well, in very Canadian fashion, Pierre Poilievre is taking this American idea that a lot of conservatives find exciting and trying to, I think, water it down and make it seem more like polite and palatable to Canadians. And so Poilievre released his platform this week, and he's calling for tens of billions of dollars of tax cuts, and he says he's gonna cut the federal bureaucracy by like 17,000 positions a year, but he says he's gonna do it without mass layoffs, and there's no mention of Doge or Elon Musk or anything, even though Poilievre, I think, senses in some level that his supporters can read that into the plan.
Yeah, read between the lines. You know what we're getting at. That makes total sense. So this article really focuses on some information that you got from a conference called Canada Strong and Free Network. Can you talk about what this conference is, like who is really coming together for something like this?
So this conference is sort of a Canadian version of CPAC. And it represents a big networking opportunity for Canada's conservative movement. And so you have conservative premiers, you have conservative thought leaders, and then you have a bunch of corporate people who have viewpoints that could also be described as conservative. And basically they all get together in Ottawa and they hash out a bunch of the big ideas and policies that people in the movement and people excited about having conservative governments in Canada should focus on.
Were there any like really big standout names there this year that people should know about?
They invited Barry Weiss to talk, and she sort of did her like usual spiel about leaving the liberal New York Times, and it seemed to get a big reaction there. She was kind of like playing the hits, the greatest hits, I guess. But
gotcha. Nothing new for the Canadian audience, just kind of picking up on the old stuff.
Yeah, kind of was depressing to me to listen to, actually.
Fair enough. I would be depressed listening to Barry Weiss as well, so I don't blame you on that. But, the core of your piece really focuses on, I guess it's a specific panel that happened there where they seem to be talking about Doge. Can you talk a bit about what that was and who was arrayed here to talk about this issue?
So there was a specific panel that I was very interested in, and it's what I ended up doing this piece on desmog and the lever for. And the panel was about addressing inefficiencies in government. So sort of like boring sounding title. The panel itself, it included a former chief of staff to Canadian Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper, really conservative guy from about 10 years or so ago. It also included a representative from Amazon Web Services Canada, an executive from the pipeline company TC Energy, which tried to build the Keystone XL pipeline into the US. And it included a senior fellow from a think tank called the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which is part of a big coalition of free market think tanks called Atlas Network. It's based in Virginia. And so in terms of the reporting I do on like climate accountability and the conservative movement, this was almost like the setup to a joke or something. Like these four people walk into a bar, like what happens next?
I love that. And, there's an energy fossil fuel guy there. So, there's going to be some kind of climate adjacent stuff for the reporting. But this is a much broader story as well that I feel like we have been watching Doge play out for the past few months in the United States. The repercussions of that, everything happening in the United States as a result of it, the upheaval in the US government, what that means for Americans more generally. Is it surprising to you that you're still seeing conservatives in Canada talk about doing something similar, even if they don't always want to use the term Doge?
Yeah, I mean, I was totally surprised that they just launched into talking about Doge, because obviously that's been such a huge news story in the US and has become so politically toxic and has led to nationwide protests and resulted in Elon Musk being one of the most unpopular political figures in the country at the moment. But this event starts at the Canadian Conservative Conference, and the moderator, who is this oil and gas executive, he basically launches into it and he's like, we've been paying very careful attention to Doge, and he addresses the former Stephen Harper guy and he says, so what do you think? Like, how could we do a Doge in Canada? And the former Harper guy's name is Ian Brody. To my kind of surprise and amazement, he just like launches into a very specific playbook for how a Pierre Poilievre government could replicate Doge. And because of some like legal and constitutional differences between Canada and the US that frankly, I'm not going to pretend to like really understand. This guy Brody is like, actually in Canada, we could do it faster than Trump is doing in the US right now.
Absolutely incredible. Like you would even want to do it faster after all that you've seen down there. But of course, this is coming from a particular perspective, right? These are the people who would be probably enjoying what they're seeing in the United States and think that it is a good thing. I was a bit struck by this formulation of this panel, the type of people who were on it, and how open they were to be making these arguments, right? Because one of the things that we saw in the past week was some of the tech folks trying to distance themselves from the idea of a Doge specifically, and that their group Build Canada is a Doge. But here you have people from many different parts of this conservative movement, from corporate Canada, making this explicit argument for a Doge, saying that this is something they want to see and how we would potentially even achieve it.
Yeah, and the part that really stuck out to me is when the executive from the pipeline company, TC Energy, he starts riffing a little bit on what you do with the critics of development in Canada. And he sort of goes, these are like anti-development groups. They're sort of opposed to resource extraction. And this pipeline guy, sort of asks to the room, like, how do we deal with these groups who obviously would be critics of any Doge style program? And so this is when it gets sort of like a little bit chilling for me, and others have pointed this out in sharing the piece. This guy, Tim Sargent, who's a senior fellow with Macdonald Laurier Institute, like very libertarian guy, he jumps in and he says basically like, we could create a list of like $20 billion worth of cuts like tomorrow. We have to just start like doing them as hard and fast as possible. At the same time, we're cutting government funding to these potentially critical groups. And then Sargent is basically like, if we do it so fast at the same time that we're implementing all these other policies that the critics don't like, they won't know where to look, how to act. They'll just be overwhelmed. It's sort of like, it reminded me of like Steve Bannon's Flooding the Zone.
Yeah, that's a really good comparison. And even when you're talking about that, it makes me think about how we've been seeing these stories about how the Trump administration is potentially looking at targeting environmental groups, potentially on Earth Day itself, right, to go after their funding and things like that. Seeing very similar language in Canada as well as in terms of how these conservative folks would want to approach it. I wanted to go back to Ian Brody for just a second. And you were talking about there how he was kind of laying out a program for what a Doge in Canada could potentially look like. And I know you said, obviously the constitutional differences and stuff are a bit above, I think, both of our pay grades or, knowledge levels on these specific aspects of how government works and whatnot. But what was the idea that he had for how a Doge would be implemented in Canada and what it would look like?
He advised that a new prime minister in Canada, and he very much seemed to be referring to like a Pierre Poilievre government. This new prime minister would gather together the Privy Council, which are basically like, they help advise the prime minister and sort of like top level federal policy in the country. You get this Privy Council all on board and sort of give them targets for the type of cuts to government they need to do. You pull your cabinet together, and then you basically have some of the most powerful people in the country sort of just like going at the bureaucracy with a chainsaw, similar to what Elon Musk is doing. And actually the pipeline guy, at one point in this conversation where they're all sort of like dreaming about what this could look like in Canada, he brings up the Malay government in Argentina as another possible example that Canadians could look to as a way to slash government, which I just thought was like totally insane given what's playing out in Argentina.
It's absolutely incredible that these people, I don't know, I guess they're among friends, right? They're at this conservative conference, but just to be like so open with so many of these things. Yeah, we want to do a Doge. Yeah, we want to go after our enemies. Yeah, we think Javier Milei has been a great example for us. And I wanted to talk about the tech piece of this as well, right? Because as you said, and as you wrote about in the piece, there was a senior public policy person from Amazon Web Services Canada on this panel as well, which feels like a bit of a weird place for someone like that to be. What was she saying about how Amazon or the tech industry would potentially contribute to a project like this?
If she felt that any of this was bad or offensive or shouldn't be done in Canada, she definitely didn't express that. And instead, she seemed to be offering the full support of Canada's tech industry to implementing some sort of Doge program. And there were a few lines from her that really stuck out to me. So she was imagining that like a federal minister could have an iPad and some sort of tech, I guess, provided by Amazon or another company in Canada, and it would have a list of all of the federal departments and programs, how much money was being spent on them, what they were kind of doing. And then I guess this minister would just go along and be like, oops, I don't like that program, like slash, I don't like this program, slash.
Just do your little swipe to the left or whatever and kill the program. Yeah.
Yeah. There goes climate research in the north. Whoops. And she had some line, I'm kind of paraphrasing from the piece, where she said, having this data provided by the tech industry can give you the political cover to make some of these decisions because you're able to defend them with hard data to the Canadian public. So it seemed, based on this Amazon person's comments, that the tech industry would be all in on this type of program in Canada.
Which is not particularly surprising, right? Because we have already seen these initiatives like Build Canada and Canada Spends that are coming out of Canada's tech industry, supported by many Canadian tech executives that are effectively arguing the same thing. Some of them, like Jen St. Dennis's report in the Tyee, has shown, have explicitly argued on Twitter and in other forums for a Canadian Doge, even if now some of them are trying to kind of roll that back or walk away from it. And we've also had this open letter from the Council of Canadian Innovators, this tech lobby group, basically saying that they want to see these changes in procurement and how the economy works, try to benefit themselves, right? But I think what was more surprising was, okay, yeah, you have these executives or whatnot from various Canadian tech companies coming out and saying these things, but to actually have someone, a public policy person from Amazon on stage at a conservative conference, basically being like, here's the way we could support your program to gut the Canadian government, is just like kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah, and like it will give you political cover. We'll provide you a bit of cover to do this. And yeah, you're right. It's interesting with some of the Build Canada stuff. They have walked back a little of their message and said, we're not trying to do a Doge in Canada, even though members of Build Canada have specifically said online, let's do Doge in Canada. But I think it signals that they're starting to realize how politically toxic all of this stuff looks like outside of their little worlds. Because at this conservative conference in Ottawa, it seemed like the crowd was really into this and they weren't getting any objections or critical pushback whatsoever. But I think the vast majority of Canadians or Americans or whatever country where this sort of thing takes place are rightly kind of horrified by the assault on programs that make government function. But I do think on one level, the way people talk about Doge in Canada is their way of signaling that they like Trump without having to say Trump's name out loud, because Trump himself has become so politically toxic and radioactive in Canada due to him launching like a tariff war on the country and the rest of the world. And so a lot of leading conservatives, they're advocating for like a Canada First policy. They're criticizing Trump, but then at the same time, they'll go ahead and say like, oh, we should do Doge here. And we actually like what Trump is doing in the US. It's sort of this weird dichotomy.
We've been talking a lot about the conservatives, but I wanted to shift to the liberals, right? Because a few months ago, it looked like Pierre Poilievre was going to be the next prime minister. That was all kind of in the can, but now things have completely changed, and it looks like the Liberals and Mark Carney are going to be our next government and likely even have a majority government. But Mark Carney has been talking a lot about promoting AI, about rolling it out in the federal public service, about making the public service and government more efficient and reducing spending. Is there any concern that some program like this might actually come to fruition under the Liberal Party as well?
Well, Mark Carney has said that he would effectively stop the growth of the federal bureaucracy. And you're right, he's kind of been pretty supportive of AI and also the oil and gas sector. He said we need to build all of these new pipelines in order to counter the economic threat from Trump in the US. So I wouldn't want to say that the liberals and conservatives are like totally equivalent in how they're viewing these types of initiatives. But it does seem that even with all the chaos and public pushback to Doge and the Trump administration, that in some way they are sort of like stretching the Overton window on some of this stuff. And you're seeing the liberals, who aren't exactly like a leftist party or anything, but they sort of portray themselves as center or center left. They're sort of being like pulled in this subtle direction towards these type of government cutting policies. I mean, I think personally that's the exact wrong way to go. And we've had decades of evidence since the Thatcher Reagan years that austerity is actually really horrible for society and makes inequality worse. So I think that there should be public concern and pushback against the whole range of this type of stuff, and not just the most extreme forms we're seeing coming from the conservatives.
I definitely agree, right? I'm more than happy to have a liberal government over a conservative one, but that doesn't mean that they get a free hand to do whatever they want. We still need to be concerned about what they might do as well. Jeff, it was really great to read this report on how the conservatives are thinking about this. Keep up the great work, and thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
So that was our interview with Jeff. You can see how there is some really crazy stuff in this story. And basically that happened at this gathering, right? You had fossil fuel executives pointing to Javier Milei as a good example for Canada to follow. You had the senior public policy person at Amazon Web Services Canada talking about how cloud services in the tech industry could help create a platform to do these massive cuts to the federal government and the public service. Like, these are wild things to be seeing, and how this conservative movement feels that this would actually be easier to implement in Canada than it would be in the United States because of the different structures of government. So again, this is something we need to be on guard for. Luckily, it looks like the Conservative Party is not going to win this election. If you're in Canada, make sure to go out and vote if you haven't already in the advanced polls. But I think we should still be on guard for what the Liberal Party might try to do with AI and all this other stuff. And if I publish a story about that before Friday, we'll stick it down in the show notes.
Shut down Canadian Doge before it has a chance to be born. Canadians, go get them. Obviously, you're not going to vote for the Conservatives if you're listening to Shock. Probably, but yeah.
We don't need to worry about that, I don't think. Unless it's like Intel gathering or something. Final stories of the week. How about you start us off, Ryan?
It's always good to have a fairly inconsequential but just absurd and humorous story included in these roundups. So how could we not bring up the story of Henry Blodgett, the founder of Business Insider, who has started a Substack and felt like he was maybe missing out on the AI boom. So he used AI to make a newsroom and to craft a whole media C-suite. And then he generated a headshot for his AI media executive, who was a woman. And then he promptly decided to hit on her and to sexually harass his AI subordinate, and then to write about it, and then to publish this and post this online, where it was, as you might expect, roundly mocked. It's so insane to me. Like, I guess this is, a true innovator. You can't, we can't empathize because they're just so far beyond us. I guess this man is richer than any of us ever will be.
I'm happy to see that the woke ideology has not made it into his newsroom, and he can still sexually harass his chatbot employees just like he would his regular ones.
This is Trump's DEI-free America. You can make an AI-generated newsroom and hit on your employees with total impunity, which is so absurd.
Oh my God, man.
And bleak, but it also, there is this kernel in there that I do think it's worth underlining and pulling out. This is why AI is so alluring to so many executives and CFOs, because they do see a future where they're like, oh, if all of our workers are AI, we don't have to worry about a toxic work environment, or we don't have to worry about sexual harassment lawsuits. Even as we've seen the mixed results of actually adopting AI enterprise software, companies are still trying to do it. The AI companies are still selling it on these grounds because this dream is so alluring to them. It's just imagine if we could just hit on our hot AI avatar subordinates and no one would get mad, and we could just do that all day long. And if other people do it, then we don't have to pay for it. There's no lawsuit. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah, they're clearly not spinning up the AI agent for the HR department. That one's staying away.
Still
great
in
story,
beta.
great find. I hadn't heard of this one before you brought it up. So yeah, wild. Our next story is on XAI, back to Elon Musk. People might have seen an earlier story earlier this year about a data center that XAI had been spinning up in Memphis, Tennessee, and the potential kind of environmental implications of that. Well, more recent reporting based on leaked aerial images show that the data center is now operating 35 methane gas burning generators. It has permits for none of them and has only applied for permits to run 15. And we know that this data center is located in near a traditionally black part of the city, which has experienced greater environmental impacts and health effects over the past number of years, air pollution, things like that. And XAI is only continuing that problem and is doing so illegally. It doesn't have the permits to operate these things and is not even seeking them. It's a wild story.
As always, AI is going to help us solve climate change, right? AI is going to bring us into this brighter future. It sure seems on the ground to be accelerating all of the trends that were already well underway. Another great example of what's actually happening on the ground here versus the promises. And it makes me think of, I've been reading Empire of AI by Karen Howe. It's not out yet, but it's such a great book that
No spoilers.
No spoilers. Anyways, it argues that AI development is taking place under a very imperial sort of framework based on exacerbating certain conditions, extracting labor, exacerbating environmental conditions, only to concentrate profits at the top. Stuff that's listeners of System Crash will be quite familiar with, but articulated in such a beautiful way. Anyways, thanks for highlighting that, Paris. OpenAI released a new model. As those who follow this kind of stuff will already know, the news that came out of it was initially that, oh, it's so great. I think Tyler Cohen said it felt like AGI was here when he used it. But then, of course, subjected to actual empirical use cases and benchmarks, it runs into some of the same flaws that a lot of the old models do. And in fact, sometimes more. PC World notes that OpenAI's in-house benchmark person QA, which is used to measure the factual accuracy of AI models, when talking about people, found that O3, the new model from OpenAI, hallucinated in 33% of responses, while O4 Mini did even worse at 48%. That is like a ton of hallucinations, which means it's getting things factually wrong. It's just making shit up at a rate that is much higher than the old ones, which O1 and O3 Mini, which were yesteryear's models, hallucinated at 16% and 14%. That's a huge jump, and there's a number of things to glean from this. Number one, we hear an awful lot, if you ever have to listen to people talk about AI, about how this is the worst that it will ever be. And cases like this are pretty clear indicators that that's not true. It could get better. Things could get better. They could resolve issues like this, but there are so many different factors in. And number two, we have to face the possibility that maybe they don't really care about getting these things factually accurate. If they're more convincing seeming, if they're more fluid, if the interface is better, if all of these factors are good enough, then maybe they're just ultimately abandoning sort of the accuracy element because it doesn't matter as much to them if they can still sell it. They're talking about building a social media network now. That's OpenAI's next big plays. They want to compete with Facebook to build a social media network. And as we well know,
that I'm using the OpenAI social media network. Like, give me a break. They also talked about buying Chrome. And I was like, yeah, that's the last thing we need is Chrome with even more AI features. Like, if there's anything that's going to spur browser innovation, it's OpenAI taking over Chrome.
Well, that's where we are now. And yeah, I guess obviously it could go the way of OpenAI's App Store, which has been just a dud, a huge. But also, people are chatting with ChatGPT endlessly. They still have to solve the compute and energy issues if that's ever going to be profitable in any kind of way. But we're truly in the throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks phase of OpenAI.
Well, and I would just say some people are chatting with ChatGPT endlessly. I think that's actually still quite a small percentage.
A small percentage.
Yeah. Our final story is just about battery developments that we're seeing from these Chinese automakers and battery companies, going back to what I was mentioning earlier. You might remember the story from, I guess it was a few weeks ago or a month or so ago or something like that, where BYD, this massive battery and electric vehicle company, or vehicle company in general, in China, announced that it had made this breakthrough on fast charging abilities that it's going to slowly start rolling out because it will require new chargers and a different kind of battery in kind of future vehicles. Well, CATL, which is, again, a major battery maker in China, has announced that it has an even bigger breakthrough now that will allow even quicker charging and things like that. And, there's still some skepticism as to how realistic these advancements will be in the real world. And I think we're going to need to wait to see about real world testing on those sorts of things. But I do think that we're clearly seeing the Chinese companies move further, move faster. They're dominating more market share. They're making technological advancements that we're not seeing by Western automakers to the same degree, and certainly not by Tesla, going back to what we're seeing there. I think again and again, we see that these companies are leaving Tesla in the dust because Tesla can't innovate. It's not updating its vehicle line. It's not actually achieving the technological breakthroughs that Elon Musk claims are constantly on the horizon. But these Chinese companies are actually doing things, are actually innovating. And I don't think that we're going to see these companies be held to China, be kind of restricted in the way that the United States would like to see, and they are just going to continue dominating more and more market share globally as American companies, as Western automakers more broadly, cannot keep up. So I think this is a story we're just going to continue watching and seeing how it plays out.
We covered a lot of ground today.
yeah, we covered a ton of stuff. And I think these are all really important issues that people need to be paying attention to. And obviously, we're going to keep doing that on System Crash every week. So System Crash is hosted by Paris Marks and Brian Merchant. That's us. Production is by Eric Wickham. Our theme music is Dystopia by our good friends in Yacht. Support the show on patreon.com/systemcrashpod to get a monthly bonus episode. Bye.